Every city in America is running a calculation it never shows you. On one side, the engineering, the infrastructure, the systems that make modern urban life possible. On the other side, the geography, the climate, the physical reality that those systems are holding at bay. In most cities, the margin between those two sides is wide enough that the calculation stays hidden. In 9 specific cities, the margin is so thin that a single serious disruption, a grid failure, an earthquake, a prolonged supply chain collapse, tips the balance, and the environment wins immediately and completely. 9 cities, each failing a different combination of the same 3 tests. Can people get out? Can the environment sustain life without powered infrastructure? And does the local resource base support the population when external supply stops? The cities that fail all 3 do not produce difficult survival scenarios. They produce arithmetic. New Orleans sits in a bowl, not metaphorically, literally. The city's average elevation is 6 feet below sea level, held in place by a levee system that requires continuous powered pumping to function. The moment the pumps stop, the city does not flood gradually. It fills. Water moves from the lake, from the river, from the surrounding wetlands, into the bowl that was always waiting for it. The levee system protecting New Orleans requires approximately 20 large pumping stations operating continuously to maintain the city's drainage. Those stations run on electricity. In Hurricane Katrina, the pumping infrastructure failed, and large portions of the city remained underwater for weeks. That was with the full weight of federal disaster response eventually arriving. In a grid-down scenario without that response, the flooding is not a temporary emergency. It is the permanent condition reasserting itself. The evacuation geometry is the compounding problem. New Orleans sits on a narrow crescent of land between Lake Pontchartrain to the north and the Mississippi River to the south, with swampland in every other direction. The exits are limited to a handful of bridges and the elevated highway corridors that become the only passable routes when surrounding terrain floods. In Hurricane Katrina's evacuation, those routes were gridlocked for over 12 hours under controlled conditions, with fuel available and most infrastructure intact. The city also sits in an active hurricane corridor. The Gulf Coast delivers Category 4 and 5 storms to Louisiana at a frequency that makes the question not whether, but when. Without the pumping infrastructure and the storm surge barriers that require power to operate, every hurricane season becomes a direct existential threat to a city that is already below the waterline it is fighting to maintain. Houston demonstrated in February 2021 exactly what its failure mode looks like. A winter storm that most American cities would handle without significant disruption knocked out power for approximately 4 million Texas homes and businesses for days. The grid failed because it was not winterized for the conditions it encountered. Pipes burst throughout the city. Water treatment plants went offline. People died of hypothermia inside their own homes. And that was a weather event, not a collapse, with relief eventually arriving and systems eventually restoring. The structural vulnerabilities it revealed were documented in real time by millions of people experiencing them simultaneously. Those vulnerabilities have not been resolved. The Texas grid remains largely separate from the national grid, limiting the ability to import power during regional failure events. The winterization improvements made after 2021 were partial and contested. The preview is on record, and the conditions that produced it remain substantially unchanged. Houston is flat, completely, uniformly flat, in a way that creates flooding vulnerability across the entire metropolitan area simultaneously during major rain events. Hurricane Harvey in 2017 dropped 60 inches of rain on parts of the Houston metro, flooding hundreds of thousands of homes and producing a traffic evacuation disaster that trapped people in vehicles as water rose around them. The flatness that makes Houston easy to build on makes it catastrophically difficult to drain and impossible to evacuate efficiently when every road floods at the same time. The petrochemical infrastructure surrounding Houston, the largest concentration of refining and chemical manufacturing in North America, becomes an active hazard in a collapse scenario. Facilities that require continuous monitoring and powered safety systems, when those systems fail, do not simply go quiet. They leak, combust, and contaminate in ways that add chemical exposure to the survival equation for everyone attempting to evacuate through or past them. Jacksonville, Florida. Jacksonville is the largest city by land area in the contiguous United States, which sounds like a survival advantage until you examine the geography that produces that size. The city sprawls across a river delta system where the St. Johns River meets a network of tributaries before reaching the Atlantic, creating a geography of water barriers that divide the city into sections connected by a limited number of bridges. In a collapse scenario, those bridges are the choke points that determine survival. Jacksonville has approximately a dozen significant bridges connecting its various sections, and the population of 1.6 million people must route through those structures to evacuate. When accidents block bridges, when fuel runs out, or when the bridges themselves become contested, the city's dispersed geography transforms from an asset into a series of isolated pockets with no route to each other or out. The hurricane vulnerability is the physical death sentence. Jacksonville sits at a geographic funnel where the Florida coastline angles inward, concentrating storm surge from major Atlantic hurricanes into the St. Johns River system in a way that pushes water upstream into the city rather than away from it. A major hurricane making landfall at the right angle produces storm surge that moves inland along the river corridor rather than receding. FEMA modeling of major hurricane scenarios for the Jacksonville area produces storm surge projections that would inundate significant portions of the city under conditions that evacuating the population beforehand would require days of warning to address. Sacramento. Sacramento sits at the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers at the center of the Central Valley, which makes it a water-rich location in physical terms and a water trap in collapse terms. The rivers surrounding the city are managed by an extensive levee network protecting against seasonal flooding. Those levees require maintenance, and the consequence of their failure is not temporary flooding, but prolonged inundation of a city that sits in a floodplain. The California Delta that Sacramento feeds into is one of the most complex water management systems in the world, moving water from Northern California snowmelt to the population centers of Southern California through a network of channels, pumps, and managed flows. When that system fails, the water does not simply stop moving efficiently. It moves according to its natural gradients, which in the Delta means saline intrusion from San Francisco Bay, pushing into the freshwater channels that Sacramento depends on. The water surrounding the city becomes progressively less drinkable as the managed system that prevents salt intrusion stops functioning. The wildfire encirclement problem defines the eastern and northern approaches. The Sierra Nevada foothills immediately east of Sacramento and the coastal ranges to the west experience some of the most intense wildfire activity in California. In a grid-down scenario where the electrical infrastructure that ignites many California wildfires is gone, but dry vegetation, wind, and ignition sources from human activity remain, Sacramento can find its evacuation routes east blocked by fire simultaneously, with its western routes blocked by Bay Area gridlock and its northern routes constrained by the geography of the Sacramento Valley. San Jose. The irony that the capital of global technology infrastructure sits in one of the most infrastructure-dependent and geographically constrained survival environments in America is not subtle once you examine the specifics. The region that designs the systems the world depends on is itself dependent on systems with no local redundancy or fallback. San Jose and the Silicon Valley broadly are enclosed by geography on three sides. The Santa Cruz Mountains to the west create a barrier that limits the route options toward the coast and produces road corridors that are single-lane and winding through terrain where a single accident blocks all traffic in both directions. The Diablo Range to the east limits routes toward the Central Valley to a handful of mountain passes. The San Francisco Bay to the north concentrates the population into a peninsula where the evacuation geometry resembles Manhattan more than it resembles a mainland city. The major routes out of the South Bay, Highways 101 and 280 north toward San Francisco, 17 west over the Santa Cruz Mountains, and 101 south toward the Central Valley, carry the traffic load of one of the most densely populated and highest vehicle per household regions in America through terrain that bottlenecks severely under conditions far less stressful than a collapse evacuation. The Bay Area as a whole sits on the Hayward, San Andreas, and Calaveras fault systems, any of which is capable of producing a major earthquake that compromises bridge infrastructure simultaneously across the region. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, a 6.9 magnitude event, collapsed a section of the Bay Bridge and caused widespread structural damage across San Jose, with a population far smaller than the current one. A comparable or larger event today produces evacuation route failures. At the moment, evacuation becomes necessary, not before, leaving no time to adapt to the infrastructure loss before the window closes. Norfolk, Virginia. Norfolk has a targeting problem and a flooding problem, and the two compound each other in a way that makes the combination uniquely dangerous. Naval Station Norfolk is the largest naval installation in the world. It is unambiguously on every rational nuclear targeting list for any adversary, with the capability to strike American strategic assets. The Hampton Roads area broadly, containing multiple military installations, including Langley Air Force Base and a dense concentration of shipbuilding and defense infrastructure, represents the highest military target density on the eastern seaboard. The fallout corridor from strikes on those installations runs with the prevailing wind patterns across the Chesapeake Bay region into Virginia and Maryland, affecting areas that residents of those installations might believe are safe buffer zones, but that the wind patterns do not recognize as such, especially during seasonal shifts that intensify dispersion unpredictably across regions. The flooding problem is documented and measurable. Norfolk experiences more frequent tidal flooding than almost any other American city, a consequence of both sea level rise and the geologic subsidence of the Hampton Roads region, which is sinking at a measurable annual rate, independent of sea level change. The combined effect is that tidal flooding that was a rare event decades ago now occurs routinely during high tide under normal weather conditions. During major storm events, the road network that serves as evacuation infrastructure crosses water at multiple points and becomes impassable as water levels advance. The combination of primary nuclear targeting and compromised evacuation infrastructure means the window for leaving Norfolk in a serious scenario is measured in hours before both options close simultaneously, and the two threats do not announce themselves in sequence. They arrive together. Tampa Bay. FEMA's own modeling identifies Tampa Bay as the location with the highest storm surge risk in the continental United States. This is not a contested assessment. It reflects the specific geometry of Tampa Bay, a large, shallow, enclosed body of water that amplifies incoming storm surge from major Gulf hurricanes in a way that pushes water levels upward rather than outward. A major hurricane making direct landfall on Tampa Bay can produce storm surge projections of 15 feet or more across significant portions of the Bay Area. Tampa has not experienced a direct major hurricane hit in over a century. That gap does not reflect safety. It reflects probability that has been accumulating. The infrastructure, the coastal development, the population that has grown to over 3 million in the metropolitan area. All of it has been built during the window when the major hurricane did not arrive. When it does, the question is not whether the damage will be severe, but whether the evacuation that would be necessary to reduce casualties is logistically achievable in the time a storm's track provides. Tampa sits on a peninsula with limited northern exits. The major evacuation routes, I-75 and I-275, carry traffic loads that produce gridlock under normal conditions. In a mandatory evacuation scenario for a major storm with 48 hours of warning, historical evacuations of the Tampa region have produced severe gridlock, extending the clearing time well beyond what the storm track allows. In a no-warning collapse scenario, the mathematics of egress from a peninsular city of 3 million become unsolvable. Detroit is the only city on this list where the collapse has already partially happened, and the result is observable now, in the present, before any additional scenario activates. The city lost approximately 1 million residents over 60 years of economic decline. The infrastructure built for a city of 2 million now serves a city of 600,000, which means the maintenance burden is unchanged, but the tax base funding, it has collapsed. Water main breaks occur at a rate that reflects infrastructure aging without adequate replacement investment. Neighborhoods with abandoned structures represent fire risk that the reduced firefighting capacity struggles to address. The physical evidence of what happens when a city's economic support structure fails is distributed across Detroit's geography in a way that makes it the most thoroughly documented collapse preview in America. In a serious grid-down scenario, Detroit faces the problems other cities face, compounded by infrastructure that was already compromised. The water system serving Detroit is aging and has already produced contamination events. The heating dependency in a city that averages single-digit temperatures in January is absolute. The population that remained in Detroit after 60 years of decline is disproportionately elderly and low income, meaning the population's least able to self-evacuate and most vulnerable to cold and sanitation failures are concentrated in a city whose infrastructure is already strained. The winter timeline is the hard ceiling. Below freezing temperatures without heat kill in hours. Detroit's January average is 24 degrees Fahrenheit. Without functioning heating infrastructure, the mortality timeline for vulnerable populations is measured not in days, but in the time it takes the interior temperature of buildings to match the exterior. Seattle. The Cascadia subduction zone runs along the Pacific Northwest coast from Northern California to British Columbia, and it will produce a major earthquake, not might, will. The geologic record shows magnitude 9 or greater events occurring on roughly 300-year cycles. The last one was in 1700. The time elapsed since the last event means the stress accumulated on the fault is substantial, and the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network has been modeling the consequences of that event for Seattle with results that are not reassuring. Seattle sits on sedimentary soils and filled land that liquefies during major seismic events. Liquefaction converts solid ground to a fluid-like state, causing buildings to sink, tilt, and collapse, and causing buried infrastructure, including water mains, sewer lines, and gas lines, to rupture simultaneously across the affected area. The neighborhoods built on fill along the waterfront and the Duwamish River Valley are the highest liquefaction risk zones, and they include significant portions of the city's port and industrial infrastructure. The bridge problem is the evacuation constraint. Seattle sits between Puget Sound to the west and Lake Washington to the east, making it a peninsular city where north-south movement through the city requires using a limited number of bridges over the Ship Canal and Lake Washington. A major Cascadia event compromises those bridges structurally at the same moment that 3.8 million people in the greater Seattle metro area attempt to use them. The egress math that fails in Tampa and Jacksonville fails in Seattle for the same geographic reason, with the additional factor of infrastructure damage that occurs at the moment. Evacuation becomes necessary rather than before it. 9 cities. New Orleans below sea level with failing pumps. Houston previewing its collapse in 2021 with the structural vulnerabilities still in place. Jacksonville trapped by bridges and storm surge geometry. Sacramento surrounded by fire and salt water, intrusion from a failing delta. San Jose enclosed by mountains, bay, and fault lines that converge simultaneously. Norfolk targeted and flooding at the same time. Tampa facing the highest storm surge risk in the continental United States on a peninsula with limited exits. Detroit, where the infrastructure preview is already visible and the winter timeline is absolute. Seattle, waiting for the earthquake that the geologic record confirms is overdue on liquefying ground, with bridges that will fail at the moment they are needed most. Each one fails the survival calculation for specific, measurable, documented reasons, not speculation. Physics, hydrology, seismology, and evacuation mathematics operating without sentiment or negotiation. The cities are not death traps because of anything their residents did. They are death traps because of what they are. Complex engineered systems maintaining human habitation in environments that those systems hold at bay. The holding only works as long as the systems do. When the systems stop, the environment does not wait for permission to reassert itself. It already knows what it is. The question is whether the people inside the cities know what they are standing in before that answer becomes academic.